In a quiet corner of the Midwest where rolling hills met dense forests and the air carried the scent of pine and earth, there was a vast stretch of land that had belonged to the Miller family for generations. This land wasn't just dirt and trees. It was history, memory, and legacy wrapped into one sprawling expanse. For decades, the Millers had called it home, but as time passed, life took them elsewhere. Jacob Miller, now in his mid-40s, lived a simple life, fixing cars at a garage in Chicago. He hadn't thought much about the old family property since his grandparents passed away. He assumed it was still untouched, like it had always been. Jacob's days were filled with oil-streaked hands, the hum of engines, and the occasional banter with coworkers. But everything changed when his father died unexpectedly. Sorting through boxes of dusty papers in his childhood attic, Jacob stumbled upon something unusual: faded maps, yellowed deeds, and handwritten notes from his grandfather. These documents spoke of acres upon acres of land, over 500 of them that legally belonged to him. At first, Jacob didn't know what to make of it. His parents rarely mentioned the property, so he figured it must have been sold off or forgotten long ago. But these papers said otherwise. They confirmed that the land was still his, not just a small patch, but an enormous piece of wilderness spanning hills, forests, and streams. Curiosity gnawed at Jacob. How could such a massive plot of land exist without him knowing? Was it really still out there, untouched by time? The questions buzzed in his mind like bees trapped in a jar. Finally, during a rare week off from work, Jacob decided to visit the land. He rented a car, packed a bag, and drove hours away from the city noise, following directions scribbled on the back of one of the old maps. As he approached the area, nostalgia washed over him. He remembered visiting his grandparents here as a child, running barefoot through tall grass, climbing trees, and skipping stones across clear streams. It felt strange to think about returning after all these years, but nothing prepared him for what he saw when he arrived. Instead of the wild, untamed beauty he remembered, Jacob found rows of identical houses stretching as far as the eye could see. Where there should have been woods, fields, and winding paths, there were neatly paved streets lined with cookie-cutter homes. A sign at the entrance read, "Sunset Ridge Estates," welcoming visitors to what looked like a picture-perfect suburban neighborhood. Jacob stood frozen, staring at the scene before him. This couldn't be right. Had someone built this entire community on his land? Confused and angry, Jacob marched up to the nearest house and knocked on the door. A young woman answered, holding a baby in her arms. She smiled politely, clearly surprised to see a stranger standing there. Jacob introduced himself and asked if she knew anything about the land. Her expression shifted from friendly to wary as she explained that Sunset Ridge Estates had been developed years ago. She handed him a brochure advertising the community, complete with glossy photos of happy families and manicured lawns. According to the pamphlet, the development was fully approved and legal. Determined to get answers, Jacob visited the local government office the next day. He showed officials the deeds and maps he'd brought along, explaining that the land rightfully belonged to him. To his shock, no one seemed willing to help. Some employees avoided making eye contact, while others gave vague excuses about how difficult it would be to investigate claims against a project completed so many years ago. One clerk even suggested that Jacob might be mistaken and encouraged him to let it go. Frustration bubbled inside him. How could this happen? How could hundreds of acres of his family's land vanish without anyone noticing? Digging deeper, Jacob discovered the truth, or at least part of it. Someone had forged signatures on official documents, selling large portions of his land to developers years earlier. The fraud had gone unnoticed because no one had checked thoroughly enough, or perhaps because people hadn't cared to look. By the time construction began, the land appeared to belong to the developers. And once the houses went up, the Homeowners Association, HOA, stepped in, claiming ownership of the entire development. Residents of Sunset Ridge Estates believed they were living legally on their properties, completely unaware of the shady dealings that had made it possible. Jacob tried fighting back. He hired a lawyer, scraping together every penny he had to cover legal fees. For months he attended meetings, filed paperwork, and argued his case in court. But the process dragged on endlessly with little progress. Developers argued that too much time had passed since the supposed fraud occurred, making it nearly impossible for Jacob to prove his claim. Meanwhile, residents dismissed him as a troublemaker, trying to ruin their peaceful lives. Signs appeared around the neighborhood accusing him of greed and selfishness. Neighbors whispered behind his back, spreading rumors about why he wanted to destroy their community. Feeling defeated, Jacob retreated to his hotel room late one night, staring blankly at the ceiling. He replayed memories of his childhood, the laughter echoing through the woods, the smell of campfires, the way the stars seemed brighter out here than anywhere else. That land wasn't just property, it was a part of him. And now it was gone, stolen not only from him but also from future generations of Millers, who might never know its beauty. As he lay there, sleepless and restless, Jacob remembered stories his grandfather used to tell, tales of underground rivers flowing beneath the surface, feeding into a hidden reservoir high up in the hills. His grandfather often joked that the water could flood the entire valley if someone ever tapped into it. Back then, Jacob thought it was just an old man's rambling. Now, though, the idea sparked something in his mind. If no one would listen to reason, maybe nature itself could force them to pay attention. With renewed determination, Jacob began researching the geography of the land. He pored over geological surveys and consulted experts discreetly, learning more about the intricate network of aquifers and rivers buried deep below the soil. Slowly, a plan formed in his head, a risky, dangerous plan that might cost him everything. But as he sat alone in his room, surrounded by maps and documents, Jacob realized he had nothing left to lose. If the system wouldn't give him justice, he'd find another way to make them listen, even if it meant unleashing chaos. Jacob's mind raced as he pieced together the fragments of his plan. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and it definitely wouldn't be quick, but desperation pushed him forward. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that no one, neither the developers nor the HOA nor even the local authorities, was going to help him reclaim what was rightfully his. They had all turned a blind eye to the fraud that stole his land, and now they expected him to just walk away quietly. But Jacob wasn't the kind of man who backed down when things got tough. If they wouldn't listen to reason, then maybe they'd listen to something louder. The first step was figuring out how to redirect the underground rivers without drawing suspicion. Jacob couldn't exactly march into town and announce his intentions. People would think he was crazy, or worse, dangerous. So he decided to play smart. He hired a small team of contractors under false pretenses, telling them he needed trenches dug around the edges of the development to improve drainage. This wasn't entirely untrue. Heavy rains had caused minor flooding in the area before, so it seemed like a plausible explanation. To avoid raising eyebrows, Jacob kept the operation low-key, working only during off hours and making sure the equipment didn't attract too much attention. As the work progressed, Jacob found himself growing more anxious. Every shovel of dirt felt like a step closer to either redemption or ruin. Nights were the hardest. He barely slept, tossing and turning as doubts crept into his mind. What if this didn't work? What if someone figured out what he was doing, and even if it did work, what then? Flooding an entire neighborhood wasn't exactly something you could undo with a simple apology. Still, he reminded himself why he was doing this. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. Justice for his family, justice for the land, and justice for all the years he'd spent being ignored and dismissed. While the physical work moved forward, Jacob also began researching ways to cover his tracks. He read up on water flow patterns, studied old maps of the region, and consulted experts online under fake names. One evening, while scrolling through forums late at night, he stumbled across a post from someone describing a similar situation. The writer talked about using natural waterways to reclaim land taken illegally by corporations. Though the details were sparse, the idea resonated deeply with Jacob. It reinforced his belief that nature itself could become his ally, if harnessed correctly. Weeks turned into months, and slowly but surely, the pieces fell into place. Trenches were dug, carefully angled to guide water toward the heart of Sunset Ridge Estates. At first, nothing happened. The ground remained dry, and life in the neighborhood carried on as usual. Residents went about their days, blissfully unaware of the chaos brewing beneath their feet. But Jacob knew better. Deep below the surface, water was beginning to shift, inching closer to the foundations of those pristine suburban homes. It was only a matter of time before the pressure built up enough to burst forth. During this period, Jacob tried to keep a low profile. He avoided talking to neighbors or drawing any unnecessary attention to himself. However, staying invisible proved harder than he anticipated. A few curious residents noticed the construction activity near the edge of the development and started asking questions. Jacob brushed them off with vague explanations about routine maintenance, but he could tell some people weren't convinced. Rumors began circulating, and soon enough whispers of sabotage reached the ears of the HOA board. One afternoon, Jacob received a call from the head of the HOA, a stern woman named Margaret, who ran the organization with an iron fist. She demanded to meet with him immediately. Nervous but determined not to show it, Jacob agreed. When they met, Margaret wasted no time getting to the point. She accused him of trying to sabotage the community, citing complaints from residents and pointing out how suspicious his behavior had been lately. Jacob denied everything, sticking to his story about drainage improvements. Margaret clearly didn't believe him, but without concrete evidence, there wasn't much she could do. Still, the confrontation left Jacob rattled. He realized he needed to be even more careful moving forward. Despite the setbacks, Jacob refused to give up. He spent hours each day monitoring the progress of his plan, checking water levels and ensuring everything was working as intended. Slowly, signs of change began to appear. Basements started feeling damp and patches of grass turned soggy overnight. Some residents complained about leaks in their homes, blaming poor construction quality. Others shrugged it off as typical issues in newer developments. No one suspected that something far bigger was brewing beneath the surface. Then came the storm. It wasn't unusual for the region to experience heavy rainfall, especially during certain times of the year. But this particular storm hit with a ferocity that caught everyone off guard. Lightning split the sky, thunder shook the ground, and torrents of rain poured down relentlessly for hours. As the water surged through the trenches Jacob had created, it gained momentum, rushing toward the heart of Sunset Ridge Estates. Within hours, streets turned into rivers, cars floated away, and entire neighborhoods were submerged under several feet of water. Panic spread quickly as residents scrambled to evacuate. Parents grabbed their children, pets were herded into carriers, and belongings were hastily packed into whatever vehicles hadn't already been swept away. Emergency services rushed to the scene, rescuing stranded families and setting up temporary shelters nearby. Television crews arrived shortly after, capturing footage of the devastation. Reporters described it as a freak accident, speculating about faulty infrastructure or unpredictable weather patterns. No one, not even the authorities, suspected foul play. But Jacob knew the truth. Standing at a safe distance, watching the chaos unfold, he felt a mix of emotions swirling inside. Part of him wanted to celebrate. Finally, someone was paying attention to the mess they'd created on his land. Another part of him felt sick to his stomach. He hadn't anticipated the scale of destruction. The sight of terrified children, clutching their parents, the sound of sobbing adults mourning lost possessions. It weighed heavily on him, gnawing at his conscience like a persistent ache. Still, Jacob convinced himself it was necessary. If no one listened to reason, sometimes drastic measures were required to make them see. And as the media coverage intensified, exposing cracks in the system that allowed such fraudulent developments to happen in the first place, Jacob couldn't deny that his plan had worked, at least in part. People were finally talking about the corruption behind Sunset Ridge Estates. Questions arose about how the land had been acquired, who had approved the permits, and whether anyone had bothered to check the legality of the project before breaking ground. For the first time in years, Jacob's voice mattered. Yet, even as the world focused on the scandal unfolding before them, Jacob couldn't shake the guilt eating away at him. He told himself over and over again that he'd done what He had to do, that he'd given the system a wake-up call it desperately needed. But deep down he wondered if there had been another way. Could he have fought harder legally? Could he have found allies willing to stand by his side? Or was this truly the only path left open to him? As dawn broke over the flooded landscape, casting an eerie glow on the wreckage, Jacob made a silent promise to himself. Whatever happened next, whether he faced consequences for his actions or emerged victorious, he would honor the memory of his family's land. He would fight to ensure that no one else suffered the same injustice he had endured. Because in the end, it wasn't just about reclaiming property. It was about restoring balance, fairness, and respect for the earth, for history, and for the future. The aftermath of the flood hit Sunset Ridge estates like a tidal wave, not just physically but emotionally and legally. The once pristine streets were now rivers of mud. Debris floated where cars used to park, and homes stood like islands in a sea of water. Residents who had been displaced crowded into emergency shelters, their faces etched with exhaustion and disbelief. For many, this was more than just property damage. It was the loss of everything they'd worked so hard for. Families argued over what to salvage. Children cried as they watched toys drift away, and elderly couples clung to each other, unsure if they'd ever recover. Amidst the chaos, investigators swarmed the area, trying to piece together how such a disaster could have happened. At first glance, it seemed like a freak accident, a perfect storm of bad weather and poor infrastructure planning. But as they dug deeper, inconsistencies began to surface. Drainage systems that should have handled heavy rain were overwhelmed far too quickly. Water surged from places no one expected, gushing out of trenches that weren't on any official blueprints. It didn't take long for someone to notice the pattern. The flooding originated near the edges of the development, precisely where Jacob Miller's mysterious construction project had taken place weeks earlier. Word spread fast among the HOA board members and local officials. Margaret, the head of the HOA, called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. She paced back and forth in her temporary office at the community center, her face flushed with anger. "This isn't coincidence," she snapped, slamming a folder onto the table. Inside were surveillance photos showing Jacob supervising workers near the flooded zones. "He's behind this. I don't know how, but he orchestrated it." Others hesitated to jump to conclusions. Some argued that accusing Jacob without evidence would only make them look desperate. After all, he'd already gained sympathy from parts of the public by exposing the shady dealings surrounding the land sale. Still, Margaret insisted they couldn't ignore the mounting clues. She urged the group to contact authorities immediately, which they reluctantly agreed to do. Meanwhile, Jacob was lying low. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots, but he wasn't ready to face the consequences just yet. Instead, he spent his days watching news reports about the flood, listening to interviews with devastated residents, and reading comments online. Public opinion was divided. Some people sympathized with the homeowners, calling the event a tragedy caused by negligence. Others pointed fingers at the developers and the HOA, arguing that corruption always came back to bite you. A few even praised Jacob, though anonymously, saying he'd done what needed to be done to expose the truth. One evening, while sitting alone in his motel room, Jacob received a phone call from his lawyer. The voice on the other end sounded grave. "They're coming for you," the lawyer said bluntly. "Someone tipped off the police. They've got footage of you near the trenches, and they're putting two and two together." Jacob felt his stomach drop. He thanked the lawyer and hung up, staring blankly at the wall. His mind raced through scenarios. What would happen if he ran? Could he disappear and start over somewhere else? Or should he stay and face whatever punishment awaited him? Before he could decide, there was a knock at the door. Jacob opened it cautiously, only to find two uniformed officers standing outside. They introduced themselves politely but firmly and asked him to come down to the station for questioning. Jacob nodded, knowing resistance would only make things worse. As he stepped into the patrol car, he caught sight of reporters gathered nearby, snapping photos and shouting questions. His face flashed across television screens within hours, accompanied by headlines like, Local man suspected in devastating flood scandal. At the station, detectives grilled Jacob for hours. They showed him surveillance footage, construction permits, or lack thereof, and geological maps highlighting the altered water flow. At first, Jacob denied involvement, sticking to his story about improving drainage. But as the evidence piled up, he realized lying wouldn't help anymore. Finally, slumped in his chair and exhausted, Jacob confessed. He told them everything: the forged documents, the years wasted fighting the HOA, and finally, his decision to redirect the underground rivers. His confession shocked everyone in the room, including himself. Hearing the words aloud made the weight of his actions sink in fully for the first time. News of Jacob's admission exploded across media outlets nationwide. Talk shows debated whether he was a hero or a villain. Legal experts weighed in on the ethics of vigilante justice, while environmentalists praised his efforts to highlight the importance of preserving natural landscapes. Meanwhile, residents of Sunset Ridge Estates were torn. Some blamed Jacob entirely, calling him reckless and selfish. Others admitted they'd suspected something was off about the development all along, and wondered if his drastic measures were justified given the circumstances. As the scandal unfolded, journalists began digging deeper into the origins of Sunset Ridge Estates. They uncovered emails, contracts, and financial records linking prominent politicians, real estate moguls, and HOA board members to the fraudulent land sale. Names of powerful figures splashed across newspapers, sparking outrage. Protesters took to the streets, demanding accountability and transparency. Banks froze assets tied to the fraudulent transactions, leaving the HOA bankrupt and unable to maintain basic services in the damaged neighborhood. For Jacob, life became surreal. He was released on bail pending trial, but the court of public opinion had already sentenced him. Strangers approached him in restaurants and gas stations, either thanking him for exposing the corruption or berating him for destroying innocent lives. Friends he hadn't spoken to in years reached out, offering support or judgment. Even his lawyer struggled to navigate the case, warning him that admitting guilt might lead to severe penalties, including jail time. Despite the whirlwind surrounding him, Jacob found moments of clarity. Walking through the flooded remains of Sunset Ridge Estates one afternoon, he noticed something unexpected: nature reclaiming its territory. Grass sprouted between cracks in the pavement, birds returned to nest in abandoned rooftops, and fish darted through pools of standing water. It reminded him of the stories his grandfather used to tell about the resilience of the land. No matter how much humans tried to control it, nature always found a way to push back. Jacob also reflected on the human cost of his actions. While he still believed exposing the fraud was necessary, he couldn't deny the pain he'd caused. He thought about the families who had lost their homes, the children who wouldn't sleep peacefully for weeks, and the elderly couple he'd seen crying as they packed up photo albums salvaged from the wreckage. Guilt gnawed at him constantly, reminding him that every choice carried consequences. In the weeks leading up to his trial, Jacob made a decision. If he was going to pay for what he'd done, he wanted it to mean something. He reached out to environmental organizations, offering to work with them to restore the damaged ecosystem. He proposed turning parts of the flooded land into protected green spaces, creating a sanctuary for wildlife, and a reminder of what had been lost and what could be regained. To his surprise, several groups agreed to collaborate, seeing an opportunity to turn tragedy into progress. Jacob also met with some of the affected residents, not to defend his actions but to listen. He sat quietly as they shared their frustrations, fears, and hopes for the future. Many were angry, but a few expressed understanding, acknowledging that the system had failed both him and them. These conversations didn't erase the harm he'd caused, but they helped him see a path forward, one rooted in healing rather than destruction. By the time his trial date arrived, Jacob was prepared for whatever verdict awaited him. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he hoped his story would serve as a catalyst for change. Whether judged as a criminal or a crusader, he vowed to spend the rest of his life making amends, for the land, for the people, and for himself. Jacob's trial became the talk of the town, and soon, the entire nation. Reporters camped outside the courthouse every morning, cameras clicking furiously as Jacob walked in, his head bowed and shoulders tense. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Lawyers from both sides argued passionately, presenting evidence, calling witnesses, and debating the ethics of Jacob's actions. On one side stood the prosecution, painting Jacob as a reckless vigilante who had endangered lives and destroyed property for personal gain. On the other side, his defense team framed him as a man driven to extremes by systemic corruption, fighting to protect what was rightfully his. The prosecution laid out their case meticulously. They showed videos of the floodwaters rushing through neighborhoods, photos of ruined homes, and testimonies from distraught residents who described losing everything they owned. One woman broke down in tears on the stand, clutching a soggy photo album she'd managed to save. "We worked so hard for this life," she said, her voice trembling. "And now it's gone, all because of him." The jury watched intently, visibly moved by her words. It was clear that many people saw Jacob not as a victim of injustice, but as the architect of their suffering. But Jacob's defense wasn't without its own powerful moments. His lawyer called experts to explain how the land had been stolen through forged documents and illegal sales. They presented maps showing how developers had encroached on protected natural areas, ignoring environmental regulations. Environmentalists testified about the ecological damage caused by building hundreds of homes on fragile terrain. And then there were the stories from Jacob himself, his years of fighting fruitlessly against the HOA, his mounting frustration as doors slammed shut at every turn, and finally, his desperate decision to use nature as a weapon. One particularly poignant moment came when Jacob took the stand. Under questioning from his lawyer, he recounted his childhood memories of the land, how his grandparents had taught him to respect it, how it felt like a living part of his family. "I didn't do this to hurt anyone," he said, his voice cracking. "I did it because I ran out of options. No one cared about the truth until I forced them to look." The courtroom fell silent as he spoke, even the judge leaning forward slightly, listening intently. For the first time, some people began to see Jacob not just as a saboteur, but as someone pushed to the brink by a broken system. As the trial dragged on, public opinion remained deeply divided. Protesters gathered daily outside the courthouse, holding signs that read everything from "Justice for Sunset Ridge" to "Protect Our Land." Social media lit up with hashtags like "Our Floodgate Scandal" and "Jacob Miller Hero or Villain," sparking heated debates. Some commentators argued that while Jacob's methods were extreme, they exposed glaring flaws in how land was bought, sold, and developed. Others insisted that two wrongs didn't make a right, that flooding an entire neighborhood couldn't be justified under any circumstances. Meanwhile, investigators continued uncovering layers of corruption tied to Sunset Ridge estates. Emails surfaced revealing bribes exchanged between developers and local politicians. Financial records showed millions funneled into offshore accounts belonging to members of the HOA board. Even the construction company responsible for building the houses came under scrutiny, after whistleblowers revealed shortcuts taken during development to cut costs. Each new revelation fueled outrage, turning the scandal into a symbol of greed and unchecked power. For the residents of Sunset Ridge Estates, these discoveries brought mixed emotions. Some felt vindicated, realizing they'd unknowingly purchased homes built on stolen land. Others grew angrier, believing Jacob should have found another way to expose the fraud without destroying their lives. Tensions simmered as neighbors clashed over whether to support or condemn him. In community meetings, tempers flared, accusations flew, and alliances shifted almost daily. Amidst the chaos, Jacob tried to focus on repairing the damage, not just physically, but emotionally. He met with more families affected by the flood, apologizing sincerely and offering whatever help he could. Though many rejected his olive branch, a few accepted, seeing his remorse as genuine. One such family was the Thompsons, whose young daughter had been particularly traumatized by the evacuation. Jacob visited them multiple times, bringing toys and books to replace those lost in the flood. Slowly, their animosity softened, replaced by cautious understanding. Jacob also threw himself into restoration efforts, working alongside environmental groups to begin healing the land. Volunteers arrived from all over the country, eager to assist in replanting trees, cleaning up debris, and restoring wetlands. Together, they transformed parts of the flooded area into lush green spaces teeming with wildlife. Signs went up marking trails and educational points, inviting visitors to learn about the importance of preserving natural habitats. What had once been rows of identical houses now resembled the wild, untamed beauty Jacob remembered from his childhood. Despite these positive steps, the legal battle loomed large. As closing arguments approached, Jacob braced himself for the verdict. His lawyer warned him that pleading guilty might result in jail time, but Jacob refused to back down. "If I go to prison, then so be it," he told her firmly. "At least, I'll know I tried to fix things my way, even if it cost me everything." When the day finally came, the courtroom was packed. Friends, family, reporters, and curious onlookers filled every seat, waiting anxiously for the jury's decision. After hours of deliberation, the foreperson stood and announced the verdict. "Guilty of criminal mischief and reckless endangerment." Gasps rippled through the crowd as Jacob exhaled sharply, steadying himself against the table. But before the judge could impose sentencing, something unexpected happened. The prosecution offered a plea deal. In exchange for testifying against those involved in the fraudulent land sale, Jacob would receive probation and mandatory community service instead of jail time. Relieved yet conflicted, Jacob accepted the offer. Over the following weeks, he appeared in court repeatedly, naming names and providing evidence that helped dismantle the corrupt network behind Sunset Ridge Estates. Developers faced charges. Politicians resigned in disgrace, and banks seized assets tied to the scandal. Justice, though imperfect, finally seemed within reach. With the trial behind him, Jacob turned his full attention to rebuilding, not just the land, but relationships. He partnered with affordable housing advocates to set aside portions of his reclaimed property for low-income families, ensuring others wouldn't face the same struggles he had. He gave talks at schools and community centers, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked greed and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Years later, visitors to the newly renamed Miller Preserve often spotted Jacob walking among the trees, pointing out spots where underground rivers flowed or recounting tales of resilience and redemption. Those scars remained from the flood, from the trial, from years of fighting. He had found peace in knowing he'd made a difference. The land once stolen and scarred was alive again, thriving thanks to his determination and sacrifice. And though opinions about him still varied, one thing was certain: Jacob Miller's story would never be forgotten. Years passed, and the scars left by the flood slowly began to heal, not just on the land but in the hearts of those who had lived through it. The once devastated expanse of Sunset Ridge Estates transformed into something entirely different, a sprawling sanctuary known as Miller Preserve. It became a place where nature reigned supreme, a testament to both destruction and renewal. Trees grew tall again, replacing the concrete foundations of what were once cookie-cutter homes. Streams flowed freely, their waters teeming with fish and frogs. Birds nested in branches that hadn't seen sunlight for decades, and wildflowers painted the landscape with bursts of color each spring. For Jacob Miller, this transformation was bittersweet. Every time he walked the trails of the preserve, he felt a mix of pride and sorrow. Pride because he had managed to reclaim his family's legacy and restore the land to its natural state. Sorrow because he couldn't erase the memories of the families displaced, the lives disrupted, and the anger still simmering beneath the surface. Though many people eventually forgave him, or at least understood his motivations, some wounds ran too deep to fully mend. The affordable housing initiative Jacob helped establish became one of the most meaningful parts of his redemption journey. On the outskirts of the preserve, nestled among restored woodlands, stood a small community of modest homes designed for low-income families. These houses weren't like the ones that had flooded. They were built sustainably, using eco-friendly materials and adhering to strict environmental guidelines. Residents appreciated not only the affordability, but also the opportunity to live close to nature without harming it. Jacob often visited these families, sharing meals or helping out with repairs. In them, he saw hope, a chance to break the cycle of greed and exploitation that had defined Sunset Ridge Estates. Word of Jacob's efforts spread beyond the local community. Environmental organizations hailed him as an unlikely hero, someone who had turned personal tragedy into collective progress. Schools invited him to speak at assemblies, where he told students about the importance of protecting natural resources and standing up against injustice. His talks always ended with the same message: change is hard, and sometimes it comes at a cost. But if you believe in something enough, you'll find a way to make it happen. Still, Jacob never sugarcoated his story. He openly admitted his mistakes, acknowledging the pain he'd caused while explaining why he'd felt compelled to act. This honesty earned him respect from many, though not everyone agreed with his methods. Some former residents of Sunset Ridge Estates refused to forgive him, viewing his actions as unforgivable no matter the circumstances. Others, however, came to see him as a flawed but determined man who had tried to right a wrong in the only way he knew how. One particularly memorable encounter happened during a community event held at the preserve. A woman approached Jacob hesitantly, her eyes filled with emotion. She introduced herself as Lisa Carter, a mother of two who had lost everything in the flood. For years, she had harbored resentment toward Jacob, blaming him for ruining her life. But standing there amidst the beauty of the restored land, she realized something important. "You took away my home," she said softly, "but you gave me back something else, a reminder of what really matters." Tears welled up in Jacob's eyes as he hugged her, grateful for her grace and understanding. As the preserve flourished, so did Jacob's relationship with the land. He spent countless hours exploring its hidden corners, rediscovering the magic he'd known as a child. Walking along the trails, he could almost hear his grandfather's voice telling stories about the underground rivers and the reservoir high up in the hills. Those tales, once dismissed as old man's ramblings, now seemed prophetic. Nature had indeed reclaimed what was hers, proving stronger than any human attempt to control it. Jacob also found solace in mentoring young people interested in conservation. He partnered with local schools to create programs focused on environmental stewardship, teaching kids about sustainable practices and the value of preserving green spaces. Many of these students went on to pursue careers in ecology, inspired by Jacob's passion and perseverance. One teenage boy named Ethan reminded Jacob of himself at that age, curious, idealistic, and eager to make a difference. When Ethan graduated high school and decided to study environmental science, Jacob gifted him a hand-drawn map of the preserve, inscribed with the words, "Protect what you love." Despite his successes, Jacob remained humble. He knew he wasn't perfect and didn't pretend otherwise. Late at night, sitting alone in his cabin overlooking the preserve, he often thought about the choices he'd made, the risks he'd taken, the lives he'd impacted, and the lessons he'd learned. Sometimes regret would creep in, whispering doubts about whether he could have done things differently. But more often than not, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. He had fought for what he believed in, even when it meant sacrificing everything. And in doing so, he had sparked changes far greater than he ever imagined. The media continued to cover Jacob's story sporadically, especially around anniversaries of the flood. Journalists marveled at how a single act of defiance had exposed widespread corruption and inspired a movement toward sustainability. Documentaries were made, books were written, and awards were given. But Jacob shied away from the spotlight. He preferred working behind the scenes, letting the preserve speak for itself. To him, the real victory wasn't fame or recognition. It was seeing the land thrive and knowing future generations would inherit something worth protecting. On the fifth anniversary of the flood, a ceremony was held at the preserve to honor all those affected by the disaster. Former residents, volunteers, activists, and government officials gathered under a canopy of trees, sharing stories of loss, resilience, and renewal. Jacob delivered a heartfelt speech, thanking everyone who had contributed to the restoration effort. "This land belongs to no one person," he said, his voice steady and clear. It belongs to all of us, to cherish, to protect, and to pass on to those who come after us. After the ceremony, as guests wandered through the preserve, Jacob lingered near the edge of a stream, watching sunlight dance on the water's surface. A group of children played nearby, laughing and splashing in the shallows. Their joy reminded him of his own childhood, running barefoot through these same woods, dreaming of adventures yet to unfold. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what the future might hold, not just for the land, but for the people connected to it. Jacob Miller's journey had been long and difficult, marked by moments of triumph and tragedy alike. He had faced down powerful enemies, endured public scrutiny, and grappled with guilt over the consequences of his actions. Yet through it all, he had stayed true to his purpose, honoring his family's legacy and fighting for justice, no matter the odds. And as he stood there, surrounded by the sights and sounds of a thriving ecosystem, he knew one thing for certain: the land was alive again, and so was he.